This particular session really covers two critical, accountable social laws: murder and adultery. But we're going to begin at the beginning with this paragraph 18, which has to do with our spiritual nature, praying. I'm going to begin by reading and sharing with you a letter from the Universal House of Justice. Here's what it opens with. In the course of the 4-year plan, now the House has got so many 4 or 5-year plans that you probably don't know which one this is, but they're referring to the plan from 1996 to the year 2000, Rizwan to Rizwan. In the course of the 4-year plan, we have been reviewing those laws of the Kitab-i-Aqdas which are not yet universally applied, in order to determine which of them it would be timely to implement now. The sentences beginning the next two paragraphs. In every land, we see a growing thirst for spiritual life and moral clarity. I found that word very interesting, that the morals of the world need to be clarified. The first sentence of paragraph 3, we, the House of Justice, have determined, therefore, that it is imperative for all the believers to deepen their awareness of the blessings conferred by the laws which directly foster the devotional life of individuals and thus of the community. So what does the House of Justice do but give to the Baha'is of the world obedience to the Kitab-i-Aqdas, paragraph 18, which Kathy will read.
It hath been ordained that every believer in God, the Lord of judgment, shall each day, having washed his hands and then his face, seat himself and turning unto God, repeat Allah 95 times. Such was the decree of the maker of the heavens, when with majesty and power, he established himself upon the thrones of his names. Perform ye likewise ablutions for the obligatory prayer. This is the command of God, the incomparable, the unrestrained.
You know, the fact that the House of Justice said, seat yourself, is an indication that this is an obligatory prayer with no gestures or bodily movements. You can just do your ablutions and then sit and perform the obedience to saying Allahu Akbar 95 times, which leads us to reading note 33.
It hath been ordained that every believer in God shall each day repeat Allahu Akbar 95 times. Allahu Akbar is an Arabic phrase meaning God the All-Glorious. It is a form of the greatest name of God. See note 137. In Islam, there is a tradition that among the many names of God, one was the greatest. However, the identity of this greatest name was hidden. Baha'u'llah has confirmed that the greatest name is Baha. The various derivatives of the word Baha are also regarded as the greatest name. Shoghi Effendi's secretary, writing on his behalf, explains that the greatest name is the name of Baha'u'llah. Ya Baha'u'llah Pa is an invocation meaning, O thou glory of glories. Allahu Pa is a greeting which means God the All-Glorious. Both refer to Baha'u'llah. By greatest name is meant that Baha'u'llah has appeared in God's greatest name. In other words, that he is the supreme manifestation of God. The greeting Allahu Pa was adopted during the period of Baha'u'llah's exile in Adrianople. The repetition of Allahu Akbar 95 times is to be preceded by the performance of ablutions. See note 34.
I took note of that paragraph that begins with Allahu Akbar as an Arabic phrase where it says the identity of the greatest name was hidden. Because, you know, I've said before, I have been studying the word concealment in the writings. And the reason he was still hidden was, according to what my reading is, that he was more or less in the heaven of concealment with a capital C. And then you will read his writings where he said, I have come out of concealment with a small c. So I always like to study this heaven of concealment because it refers to all the manifestations of God. Now, note 34 tells us that the ablutions have a significance beyond washing oneself immediately before reciting the obligatory prayers. That note also leads us to note 16, which tells us that if there isn't any water, repeat 5 times in the name of God, the most pure, the most pure. I bring that up because going back to the December 1999 letter of the House of Justice that told the Baha'is of the world they should now say the greatest name 95 times. One of the sentences says, thus all the elements of the laws dealing with obligatory prayer and fasting are, without exception, now applicable, or as the British say, applicable. So that letter is dated 28 December 1999, if anybody wants to references themselves. Paragraph 29 of the Kitab-i-Aqdas is a most unusual law, or an interesting law. It's one sentence forbidding 4 sins: murder, adultery, backbiting, and calumny. It also brings in a 5th in the notes, which is arson, which won't be discussed in this session, but next session. So let's read paragraph 19.
Okay. Ye have been forbidden to commit murder or adultery, or to engage in backbiting or calumny. Shun ye then what hath been prohibited in the holy books and tablets.
Okay, before we look at some of the associated notes, let's examine what each of these words mean when it comes to killing. And I look these up on internet because it's easier than lifting my dictionary anymore. I have a dictionary that's 5 inches wide. Homicide is the killing of one person by another. Interesting that Baha'u'llah said that Moses committed homicide and that this was a test for the believers. He says, reflect upon the strange and manifold trials with which he doth test his servants. Consider how he hath suddenly chosen from among his servants and entrusted with the exalted mission of divine guidance him who was known as guilty of homicide. I had to say that in answer to a question when I gave a talk back in California. And there was a woman Jew in the audience who never related Moses to being a murderer. She just never thought about it. And she actually left the meeting quite upset. But Baha'u'llah said his homicide was prior to God giving him the mantle of the manifestation. So homicide is the killing of one person by another. Murder is the unlawful, premeditated killing of one human being by another. Manslaughter is the crime of killing a human being without malice aforethought or otherwise in circumstances not amounting to murder. So let's read note 35.
Ye have been forbidden to commit murder. The prohibition against taking another's life is repeated by Baha'u'llah in paragraph 73 of the Kitab-i-Aqdas. Penalties are prescribed for premeditated murder. See note 86. In the case of manslaughter, it is necessary to pay a specified indemnity to the family of the deceased. See Kitab-i-Aqdas 188.
Note 86 is involving murder due to arson. And arson is one of those subjects that we'll be covering next session. You know, friends, this particular session is not very long. So if anybody is dying to ask a question.
I have a statement I'd like to say.
Okay.
I kind of read this about murder at one point and about Moses. Moses murdered a person, a slave that was being beaten. So
he murdered a citizen who was abusing a slave.
That's what it was. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. I got that wrong. So, and you said that was before he
received the burning bush message.
Okay.
Yes. You see, what I had to say at that meeting was that every religion, every major religion has a mystery. The mystery of Christianity is the virgin birth. The mystery of the Baha'i faith is Abdu'l-Baha, because although he wasn't a manifestation of God, he was endowed with innate knowledge. So the mystery of Judaism is that Moses killed someone, and yet he was the voice of God for that period of time. God shall not be asked of his doings, is what Baha'u'llah says in one of his tablets. Okay, the forbidding of adultery. We're going to look at two notes for the understanding of this social sin. Let's read note 36.
Okay. Adultery. I'm sorry.
It gives us some distinctions of adultery.
Adultery, the Arabic word zina, here translated as adultery, signifies both fornication and adultery. It applies not only to sexual relations between a married person and someone who is not his or her spouse, but also to extramarital sexual intercourse in general. One form of zina is rape. The only penalty prescribed by Baha'u'llah is for those who commit fornication, see note 77. Penalties for other kinds of sexual offense are left to the Universal House of Justice to determine.
And now read note 77, which goes further and speaks of spiritual consequences.
God hath imposed a fine on every adulterer and adulteress to be paid to the house of justice. Although the term translated here is adultery, as adultery refers in its broadest sense to unlawful sexual intercourse between either married or unmarried individuals. See note 36 for a definition of the term. Abdu'l-Baha has specified that the punishment here prescribed is for sexual intercourse between persons who are unmarried. He indicates that it remains for the Universal House of Justice to determine the penalty for adultery committed by a married individual. See also questions and answers 49. In one of his tablets, Abdu'l-Baha refers to some of the spiritual and social implications of the violation of the laws of morality and concerning the penalty here described. He indicates that the aim of this law is to make clear to all that such an action is shameful in the eyes of God, and that in the event that the offense can be established and the fine imposed, the principal purpose is the exposure of the offenders, that they are shamed and disgraced in the eyes of society. He affirms that such exposure is in itself the greatest punishment. The House of Justice referred to in this verse is presumably the local House of Justice, currently known as the local spiritual assembly. Wow.
Yeah. Between persons who are unmarried, you know, that's just about the plot of every sitcom in the Western world. So we read in a letter dated 9 June 1974 from the House of Justice to the National Assembly of Iceland. This is what the House says: that the laws are not applicable to the Baha'is of the West. Arson, adultery, murder, and theft are all forbidden to Baha'is, but the punishment prescribed for them in the Kitab-i-Aqdas are designed for a future state of society. Such matters are usually covered by the civil laws of each country. Well, that's now very true for arson, murder, and theft, but it's not true for adultery at this time in society. It used to be true in America. Are any of you as old as me and can remember how the laws of adultery were used in America? If you wanted to get a divorce back in the 20s and 30s, you had to prove that one of the spouses was unfaithful. There was no other reason for being permitted to have a divorce. Well, it's just like Clark Gable getting to say, frankly, Scarlett, I don't give a damn. It opened up the doors for the movie industry to be unchained from any kind of morality limitations in movies. Well, the law of adultery was eventually so diluted that we now accept it as freedom of choice instead of the laws of God to refrain from this shameful act. One time I asked Ian Simple, I said, you know, Ian, I really resent the fact that I've lived my life looking over my shoulder to see what some man could do to me. Because a lot of us single women, maybe married women too, have that habit of not trusting men walking down the street. And I said, I don't understand Baha'u'llah's laws about, because all I knew about the laws of morality and sex outside of marriage was that the house would impose a financial penalty. And I remember Ian saying that, no, Marianne, the House of Justice and consultation will decide what the punishment is, depending upon the circumstances. But again, this is for a future state of society when men and women will be morally inclined to live. The Scarlet Letter was another deterrent to adultery, says one of our attendants. Who read the Scarlet Letter?
I have.
I think they made a movie out of it, didn't they?
Yes.
Okay, let's go on to backbiting and calumny.
Calumny. Isn't it?
Calumny. Well, we know what backbiting is. The other means the making of false and defamatory statements about someone in order to damage their reputation, otherwise known as slander, which has legal consequences. Most of us are familiar with Baha'u'llah condemning backbiting. One of his quotes is, "The seeker should also regard backbiting as grievous error and keep himself aloof from its dominion, inasmuch as backbiting quenches the light of the heart and extinguishes the life of the soul." That's pretty powerful. So let's read note 37.
Backbiting or calumny. Backbiting, slander, and dwelling on the faults of others have been repeatedly condemned by Baha'u'llah. In the hidden words, he clearly states, "O son of being, how couldst thou forget thine own faults and busy thyself with the faults of others? Whoso doeth this is accursed of me." And again, "O son of man, breathe not the sins of others, so long as thou art thyself a sinner. Shouldst thou transgress this command, accursed wouldst thou be, and to this I bear witness." This strong admonition is further reiterated in his last work, the Book of My Covenant. "Verily I say, the tongue is for mentioning what is good. Defile it not with unseemly talk. God hath forgiven what is past. Henceforward, everyone should utter that which is meet and seemly, and should refrain from slander, abuse, and whatever causeth sadness in men."
Rhea Khanum said that when the guardian was a little boy, before he could go to bed, he would review if he had hurt any soul during the day, and he would be unhappy until he could make amends to that friend he might have inadvertently hurt. That is the session without our discussion of inheritance. We're now going to go into the Aqdas and the inheritance part. But before we do, are there any questions about what we have read about murder and arson? Well, arson is next week. Murder and slander and adultery. They're pretty self-evident. Oh, let's go on to the laws of inheritance. It seems I'm going to begin with another House of Justice message dated February the 8th, 2001, in which it says that the laws of inheritance today is normally covered by the civil laws of intestacy at the present time. In other words, the House of Justice is telling us that the laws of inheritance are not applicable as yet. So before we discuss the 9 paragraphs, let's look at what the House of Justice wrote to an individual believer in 1996. I'm going to read this because you don't have it in front of you. Baha'u'llah clearly establishes the making of a will as one of his laws. This is something we can all do now. In the Kitab-i-Aqdas, paragraph 109, he instructs, "Unto everyone hath been enjoined the writing of a will," unquote. The importance of this law is not to be underestimated, as can be seen from a careful study of the attached compilation of newly translated extracts from tablets revealed by Abdu'l-Baha. That undoubtedly is one of the newer compilations released by the House of Justice. Not only is making a will a spiritual duty, one of the binding laws of this mighty dispensation, this is important, but it allows the individual full discretion to specify how his or her property, including the residence, is to be disposed of. And it is conducive to unity and agreement. Failure to draw up a will is considered by Abdu'l-Baha as disobedience to the command of Baha'u'llah and as non-fulfillment of the divine obligation. And it leads to the division of the individual's property according to provisions of the laws of inheritance. So complicated in my eyes are the laws of inheritance that you really are inclined to write a will. But here's what the House of Justice also says in the next paragraph of that letter. It is worth noting that the Baha'i laws of inheritance apply only when the individual dies without making a will. Indeed, one of Abdu'l-Baha's tablets seems to indicate that the very provisions of the Baha'i law of intestacy are intended as an incentive to individuals not to neglect the duty of making a will early in life. Before I left the World Center, Dennis, you may have had to do this when you were there. The House of Justice, with its Department of External Affairs, had all the staff write a will. It was a very simple will because we really didn't own anything. We lived in flats that the House of Justice owned. We didn't accumulate money to earn because we were all on the same benefit system. But what was the important thing that had to be put first and foremost in our wills, whether you're at the World Center or anywhere in the world? What is the first thing you say in the making of a will?
Is it the declaration?
That you declare your belief in Baha'u'llah.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'll have to tell you, since we've got lots of time, that when I left the World Center and moved to California, I had to make a will. And then when I came to New Mexico 17 years ago, I had to make another will because the laws of the states are different. My friend, who also worked at the World Center with her husband for a long time, she said, now, Marianne, when you go to the lawyer, don't teach the faith because you're going to have to pay him by the hour. So just have him make your will. When the will was finished and I went back to the office to have the lawyer go over it, he brought in two of the secretaries because the secretaries had to witness my signature on the will. But the first thing the man did was ask, what is the symbol on top of your stationery? Which was, of course, the symbol of the greatest name. And in front of the two girls who worked there, he started asking me about the Baha'i faith, and my will was done, so I didn't have to pay for it. So The will is also first and foremost to publicly declare your belief in Baha'u'llah. All right, so if you don't do the will, Abdu'l-Baha says, following the laws of the inheritance is not easy, especially if you have a long disunited family. So let's read paragraph 20, and then we'll read a question and answer. And this is because the laws of inheritance involves numbers. So Kathy, read paragraph 20.
We have divided inheritance into 7 categories. To the children, we have allotted 9 parts comprising 540 shares. To the wife, 8 parts comprising 480 shares. To the father, 7 parts comprising 420 shares. To the mother, 6 parts comprising 360 shares. To the brothers, 5 parts or 300 shares. To the sisters, 4 parts or 240 shares. And to the teachers, 3 parts or 180 shares. Such was the ordinance of my forerunner. He who extolleth my name in the night season and at the break of day. When we heard the clamor of the children as yet unborn, we doubled their share and decreased those of the rest. He of a truth hath power to ordain whatsoever he desireth, and he doeth as he pleaseth by virtue of his sovereign might.
So the Bab and the Bayan had these numbers for the laws of inheritance, but Baha'u'llah says, when I heard the clamor of the children, I changed it. So that will be in questions and answers number 5. So Kathy, can you look up questions and answers number 5?
I am looking.
This is all part of history. The connection between the Bab and Baha'u'llah and between the Bayan and the Kitab-i-Aqdas.
Question concerning the holy verse. Is that the one?
Yes.
When we heard the clamor, when we heard the clamor of the children as yet unborn, we doubled their share and decreased those of the rest. Answer. According to the book of God, the estate of the deceased is divided into 2,520 shares, which number is the lowest common multiple of all integers up to 9. And these shares are then distributed into 7 portions, each of which is allocated, as mentioned in the book, to a particular category of heirs. The children, for example, are allotted 9 blocks of 60 shares, comprising 540 shares in all. The meaning of the statement, we doubled their share, is thus that the children receive a further 9 blocks of 60 shares, entitling them to a total of 18 blocks, all told. The extra shares that they receive are deducted from the portions of the other categories of heirs, so that although it is revealed, for instance, that the spouse is entitled to 8 parts comprising 480 shares, which is the equivalent of 8 blocks of 60 shares, now, by virtue of this rearrangement, 1.5 blocks of shares comprising 90 shares in all have been subtracted from the spouse's portion and reallocated to the children, and similarly in the case of the others. The result is that the total amount subtracted is equivalent to the 9 extra blocks of shares allotted to the children.
Did you all get that?
Oh, yeah, sure.
You can now understand why Abdu'l-Baha is insinuating that writing a will is an incentive. I think when this particular laws of inheritance is put into effect, all local assemblies should have an accountant and a lawyer on their institution, or
Yes.
else we'll have a big world local center where we can hire people to do that sort of thing. Okay, now for those of you who are familiar of Nadar Saidi, who Nada uses quite frequently, if I'm not mistaken. I keep referring to his book, Logos and Civilization, where he speaks of the laws of the Bayan. So I'm going to read this. From the very beginning of the discussion of the law of inheritance, it is evident that Baha'u'llah is referring to the distribution of inheritance as discussed in the Arabic Bayan, and especially its logic of numbers. Logical to him, not to me. Baha'u'llah begins by stating, we have divided inheritance into 7 categories. Here, we refers to the Bab and to his law of the 10th Vahid of the Arabic Bayan. And then of course, is Baha'u'llah. The we is the Bab and Baha'u'llah. After describing that law, Baha'u'llah states, such was the ordinance of my forerunner, he who extolleth my name in the night season and at the break of day. When we heard the clamor of the children as yet unborn, we doubled their share and decreased those of the rest. He of a truth hath power to ordain whatsoever he desireth. He here is Baha'u'llah, because the Bab said all the laws are conditional on the acceptance of he whom God shall make manifest. Saidi continued, although Baha'u'llah changes the particular distribution that had been fixed in the Bayan, he confirms that the ordinances of the Bayan remain the laws of the Kitab-i-Aqdas because this is that hidden knowledge that shall never change, since its beginning is with 9, the symbol that betoken the concealed and manifest, the inviolable and the unapproachable exalted name. I don't like numbers. I fail at numbers. I never took higher mathematics. So I don't approach numbers anyway, but it has a meaning in religion. The Saidis, who are Baha'i scholars, can explain it to you much better than I will even attempt, so forgive me. Okay, let's go on to paragraphs 21 through 24. They have to do with whether or not the deceased left any offsprings. I wrote outsprings. If so, what percentage of the estate they inherit? If not, if they don't have it, calculations are given for nephews, nieces, uncles, aunts, mothers, fathers on the mother's side, on the father's side, and other stipulations. Write your wills. So let's read paragraph 24.
24 or 21?
Nope. 21 to 24 is all about, did the deceased leave this offspring?
Okay.
Did the deceased not? So let's just skip to 24.
Should the deceased be survived by none of those whose names have been recorded by the pen of the Most High, his estate shall, in its entirety, revert to the aforementioned seat, that it may be expended on that which is prescribed by God. He verily is the ordainer, the omnipotent.
To repeat, none of these laws on inheritance are applicable at this time. If they are complex now or in the future, you can see the wisdom of making a will and having your estate distributed as you desire. Baha'u'llah even has to guide the disposition of our physical property, which leads us into paragraph 25. You're on, Kathy. Yes, Kathy.
That's a question that when they refer to the aforementioned seat, is that the Universal House of Justice?
You will read in some of the questions and answers that there are certain monies that will go to the House of Justice. One of them, for example, says 30%. Again, if there's any ambiguity, the House of Justice with divine guidance will be able to say that's the local assembly or that's the House of Justice. Usually it doesn't mention the National Assembly. Interesting, what?
Yes, it is interesting.
And you know, National Assemblies are the ones, Dennis may be able to verify this. I used to work in the finance department my first 7 years at the House of Justice. And at that time, the National Assembly of the United States gave a large portion of the contributions for the World Center. Giving much larger was the National Assembly of the Baha'is of Iran until the revolution. For example, the Iranian Baha'i community was responsible for paying for 80% of the building of the seat of the House of Justice. But then soon after they started building was the Islamic Revolution, and the World Center was cut off from most of those funds. Anyway, the funds that came out of Iran. And that's why they sent people like Ali Nachavani to the Western world to encourage the Friends to give the important contributions to finish the seat. So that's a good question, Kathy.
We have assigned the residence and personal clothing of the deceased to the male, not female offspring, nor to the other heirs. He verily is the magnificent, the all bountiful. Should the son of the deceased have passed away in the days of his father and have left children, they will inherit their father's share, as prescribed in the book of God. Divide ye their share amongst them with perfect justice. Thus have the billows of the ocean of utterance surged, casting forth the pearls of the laws decreed by the Lord of all mankind.
This gives us an opportunity to address that question of the men getting more than the women. My understanding from reading the Aqdas and other goals for the future society that these laws are not ready from is that the male members of the family have the largest financial responsibility in the family. In other words, for example, you will learn under divorce that if there's an estrangement when the husband and wife are traveling, the husband can send the wife back home with or without the children, whether they have children, and he has to bear all the expenses. So there's laws in the Aqdas that heavily put on the shoulders of males the responsibility of the care of the family. Now, that doesn't negate that women can do anything that men can do, but they can't do it all at one time. You know, there's a time when they're mothers and raising the children. Baha'u'llah says they have the choice, the first choice of education. If parents don't have enough money, it has to be the girl that gets educated. So, and it says world peace cannot come into existence until women have the equal shares of the decision making in the world. so that there are still wonderful, important, critical responsibilities of women, especially the education of children. But the men have this physical responsibility. And that's the only answer that I can derive at. God is merciful, for example, in permitting women not to participate in wars. Doesn't mean they can't join the military. It means that they don't have to go and participate in the slaughter of other people. There's a balance, in my estimation, of what are the responsibilities of males and females in this new age. Let's see, you read 26. We're going to read 27 and 28.
If the deceased should leave children who are underage, their share of the inheritance must be entrusted to a reliable individual or to a company, that it may be invested on their behalf in trade and business until they come of age. The trustee should be assigned a due share of the profit that hath accrued to it from being thus employed.
You know, Baha'u'llah has a law that says everyone should be given a fair salary for fair amount, for fair work done. And if somebody is the executor of a child's estate, he should be recompensed accordingly. So you see how one law of Baha'u'llah can segue into another law. 28.
Division of the estate should take place only after the huququllah hath been paid, any debts have been settled, the expenses of the funeral and burial defrayed, and such provision made that the deceased may be carried to his resting place with dignity and honor. Thus hath it been ordained by him who is Lord of the beginning and the end.
Okay, now that paragraph tells you that you pay the hukuk, you pay your debts, and you pay the expenses of the funeral. But note 47 explains that that's in reverse, that first you pay the funeral, then the debts, and lastly, the hukuk. And that the payments come from the residue of the estate. If that is not sufficient, then it comes out of the residence and personal clothing of the deceased. So first you pay for burying the deceased. Please don't bury somebody who's not deceased, please. And then pay debts, and then pay the hukuk. Okay, what we have left now is paragraph 136, which leaves us with a feeling of the spirit of the laws, a part of the immense revelation from God for at least 1,000 years. So let's read 136, but bear in mind the preceding paragraph affects the 136. So we're going to go ahead and read 135 anyway, because it leads us into 136, and we've got 35 minutes. Thank you, Neda.
Call then to mind these words which have streamed forth in tribute to this revelation from the pen of him.
Are you reading 135?
Yes.
Okay. I think I just wrote part of it. Go ahead and read it all.
Call then to mind these words which have streamed forth in tribute to this revelation from the pen of him who was my herald, and consider what the hands of the oppressors have wrought throughout my days. Truly they are numbered with the lost. He said, should ye attain the presence of him who we shall make manifest, beseech ye God in his bounty, to grant that he might deign to seat himself upon your couches. For that act in itself would confer upon you matchless and surpassing honor. Should he drink a cup of water in your homes, this would be of greater consequence for you than your pro-offering unto every soul, nay, unto every created thing, the water of its very life. Know this, O ye my servants.
Can you imagine Baha'u'llah is the fulfillment of every past religion? And he says, if you have him sit on your couch, how blessed you are. If he drank a cup of water, how blessed you are. Shall I tell you a story about Abdu'l-Baha and water?
Yes.
He gave a talk in Philadelphia at a hotel and then announced to everybody who heard the talk late at night, he announced that in the morning he would be speaking at the Revell home. Now, the Revell were mostly Mother Revell and two sisters who worked at the World Center during the days of Shoghi Effendi and the House of Justice, Ethel and Jessie Revell. So Ethel and Jessie Revell went home with their mother to prepare the way for Abdu'l-Baha's unexpected visit the next day, which is why you won't find what he said in Proclamation. What is the book? Universal Proclamation.
Promulgation.
Mrs. Revell told the girls, whatever you do, don't let Abdu'l-Baha come into the kitchen because our faucet is broken. So when Abdu'l-Baha arrived, the first thing he did was go into the kitchen and say, I want a drink of water. So the moral is you can't foresee telling Abdu'l-Baha what to do or not to do. So Ethel told me that story herself. Now we're ready to read our final Kitab-i-Aqdas paragraph. We began with a spiritual one on prayer. We end with this one praising the manifestations of God.
Such are the words with which my forerunner hath extolled my being. Could ye but understand, whoso reflecteth upon these verses and realizeth what hidden pearls have been enshrined within them, will, by the righteousness of God, perceive the fragrance of the All-Merciful wafting from the direction of this prison, and will, with his whole heart, hasten unto him with such ardent longing that the hosts of earth and heaven would be powerless to deter him. Say, this is a revelation around which every proof and testimony doth circle. Thus hath it been sent down by your Lord, the God of mercy. If ye be of them that judge aright, say, this is the very soul of all scriptures, which hath been breathed into the pen of the Most High, causing all created beings to be dumbfounded, save only those who have been enraptured by the gentle breezes of my loving kindness and the sweet savors of my bounties, which have pervaded the whole of creation.
His exaltation of his own revelation always brings me back to a paragraph of Shoghi Effendi. You will find it in the World Order of Baha'u'llah, page 99. I particularly remember this because the House of Justice repeated it in one of its letters before I left the World Center. Here is what the Guardian said that the House of Justice repeated. to strive to obtain a more adequate understanding of the significance of Baha'u'llah's stupendous revelation must, it is my unalterable conviction, remain the first obligation and the object of the constant endeavor of each one of its loyal adherents. An exact and thorough comprehension of so vast a system, so sublime a revelation, so sacred a trust, is for obvious reasons beyond the reach and ken of our finite minds. We can, however, and it is our bounden duty to seek to derive fresh inspiration and added sustenance as we labor for the propagation of his faith through a clearer apprehension of the truths it enshrines and the principles on which it is based. That's our mandate with this stupendous revelation. Thank you for your attendance.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
I have a thought.
If there are any questions, please use your raise your hand feature. And I don't know who's speaking, but please state your name because it's hard to find you here.
Okay, this is Jamie LeBlanc. Regarding the will, the allocation for those who don't leave a will, perhaps it's something that will make even more sense in the future that we can't see now. Because, in this country, women have property and share it equally in some places with their husbands. And then some women, regardless of a husband, have things to leave. And then Baha'u'llah tells everybody to leave a will. So that means women too. You must have something to portion out. But that's not quite specified because in this section, it really seems to be directed toward a man more so than a woman, what he should leave, but not so much what a woman should leave. So in a way, women have more, well, everybody, I guess, you leave what you want if you make a will. But there will probably be a lot for the House of Justice or justices to determine when people do not leave a will, and especially when it comes in the case of a woman who is, but I think perhaps this will make more sense in the future.
Well, your question, your comments are very well stated, and it gives the opportunity of explaining that unless specifically distinguished between male and women, such as only women, only men on the House of Justice, all the laws are equal for women and men. Now, we already read that the men have the responsibility of supporting the women who are perhaps not working because they're raising children. But every Baha'i, and in the future, I don't think you probably need to be a Baha'i. You would be obedient to making a law, whether you're a man or a woman. So you're right, Jamie. I had to read your name, Jamie. That the women have to make a law also. Now, here's another thing for today, is that Baha'is don't have to marry Baha'is.
That's true.
So when a Baha'i is told it's best to have a will, certainly the other part of the marriage will say, yeah, that's important, I'll make one too. Because we began by saying about the laws of the inheritance is God wants you to do what you want to do with your money. You have every right. You've earned it. You've worked for it. And so you have the right to do what you want. But God forbid, and that is God forbid, if you don't do the will, then if you're a Baha'i, eventually the law of, and maybe the law of inheritance won't take place because everybody will write a will. I certainly will. I'm not going to get involved in numbers.
Yeah.
Leighton.
Yes, two things, Jamie. In the Kitab-i-Aqdas, where it says man, you read women. Where it says women, it means men, mutatis mutandis, unless it is specific. But more importantly, number one, in the Baha'i faith, a will is sacred. In the present world, anyone can contest another person's will. In the Baha'i faith, you cannot contest the will. It is a sacred instrument. That's number one. Number two, the importance why we should write a will is because if we don't write a will and you die intestate, a non-Baha'i cannot benefit from a Baha'i's will. So if your husband is not a Baha'i, or your wife is not a Baha'i, or your children are not Baha'i, they cannot benefit from your will on intestate. That's why it's important to write a will. And
Yeah.
number two, and because a will is sacred, they cannot contest that will in a court of law. At the moment, anybody can contest or take anybody's will to court and contest the will. But this will not happen in the world order of Baha'u'llah.
Very good points, Leighton. Very good points. And we go back to that phrase, this is for the future state of society.
Yes, yes.
Well, is it that they cannot or they're not entitled?
A will.
Oh, no, those who are not Baha'is. Is it that they cannot, or is it that they're not necessarily entitled to?
Okay, first of all, number one, let's go back to again. Because in the Baha'i faith, the will is sacred, it cannot be contested. That's number one. It cannot be contested. Today, if you are a chauffeur, if you are a maid, if you are an illegitimate child of somebody, you can contest the will if you're not mentioned in the will. In the Baha'i faith, that person cannot contest the will. That's why it's important to write a will to all the children that you may have or you thought you had. You can write a will to, in fact, let's be more dramatic. In the Baha'i faith, if I die, if I write a will, I can exclude my children and my wife from the will, and they cannot contest it. But Baha'u'llah tells us that we should do the praiseworthy thing. And there are people today who are children of people who are married, and they are not included in the will. They can contest it because they are the son or of the father or the mother, but they have been excluded from the will. In the Baha'i faith, they cannot contest it.
There are all kinds of legal qualifications for this society in the future. I think about the social laws that will be committed, that will be adjudicated by local houses of justice. Now, in the judicial system in America, if I understand correctly, you cannot testify against yourself. I don't know if this is true in all states, but in the Baha'i faith, you always have to tell the truth. So if you are brought before a local house of justice in the future, the legal laws are added to the spiritual laws. It isn't just the letter of the law, it's the spirit of the law. There was a member of the National Assembly who came to Haifa, and he explained 3 cases of a marriage that didn't have the proper parental consent. And that National Assembly didn't know what to do. And they had to turn the cases over to the House of Justice. But somebody at the World Center gave the answers to all 3 of the situations. And the House member present said, these answers are correct because what was taken into consideration was not just the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law. So local houses of justice, just like Leighton explaining the laws of inheritance, there will be all kinds of new ways of looking at justice with criminal and spiritual acts against the laws of Baha'u'llah. You know, this is a religion that belief is not enough. Baha'u'llah says belief is not enough. You must be obedient. You must serve. You must do. And the spirit of all of this is as important as the act themselves. And my next lecture will be at 8 o'clock.
Yeah, I just want to add, there was a message in the chat that says, where does it say in the writings that a will cannot be contested? If you look in Lights of Guidance, it says that a person's will is sacred, and therefore a Baha'i is not permitted to challenge the provisions of another's will. But to read more about that, to the individual who put the chat, definitely go under Lights of Guidance, under wills, and there's a lot of information there as well. Okay.
And also,
Yeah, I'm sorry, Leighton. Sorry, Marianne, let Leighton respond since he
Okay,
brought it up.
Leighton, go ahead.
Leighton, please.
It's also in the notes and the questions in the Kitab-i-Aqdas as well.
yeah, we didn't read them all.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's there as well, Nada, in the notes and the questions and answers in the Kitab-i-Aqdas.
I have no clue when this is all going to be applicable because, you know, the secrets of divine civilization not only tell governing leaders how they should be aware of the laws of God, every individual on the planet must eventually be aware of the laws of God for this new day. We're at the very beginning of it, and we're so blessed